I want to bring in our panel, and to discuss this proposed legislation. Joining us now is Alan Dershowitz, professor at Harvard Law School and author of the new book, Terror Tunnels, The Case for Israel's Just War Against Hamas. And also joining us is Dr. Mitchell Bard, executive director of the American-Israeli Cooperative-Enterprise and author of the book, After Anatevka, Tevi, and Palestine. Thanks so much for joining us, both of you.
Thank you.
Alan, critics say the proposed legislation betrays the principles in the Israeli Declaration of Independence. Does this bill subtract in any way from Israel's commitment to a democratic state devoted to human rights?
Well, let me just read you what Benjamin Netanyahu has said, because no bill is going to pass without his support. He says, here in the state of Israel, the Jewish people have achieved their state determination in a democratic state that guarantees equal rights for all of its people, all of its citizens, regardless of race, religion, or sex. I can virtually guarantee you that any law that passes the Knesset will not abolish Arabic as an official language, will not have Jewish law. First of all, the vast majority of Israelis are secular. Israel is a far more secular country than the United States, and the secular Jews would never permit Jewish law to be a source of secular law. They demand the separation of church and state. So my recommendation is take a deep breath. Israel's a democracy. It's now having elections. The end result will be simply to parallel the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence itself declares Israel essentially to be the democratic nation state of the Jewish people for equal rights for all. That's what will happen. Now let's turn for a second to Palestine. The Palestine Constitution provides that Palestine will be an Islamic state under Sharia law, with no rights for Jews and few rights for Christians. And when you talk about Israel, it's always part of the Israel-Palestine conflict. Let's always talk about Palestine. They have a law now that prohibits the sale of land to Jews. Jordan has the same law. Virtually every Arab country declares itself to be a Muslim country under Sharia law, and we don't hear any complaints about that. Israel is struggling with this because the Palestinian president refuses to recognize Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people. That's the source of this problem. This is a response to Abbas, and by the time it gets out of the Knesset, it will be a response to Abbas which declares equality and democracy as equal to the character of the state as the nation state of the Jewish people. So take a deep breath.
Dr. Bard, we want to bring you into this conversation as well. Do you think the bill provides any additional security for the state of Israel, and does it put Israel in great danger?
Well, I agree with everything that Alan said. I think that this is really being overhyped, and really at this point it's probably moot now that the Knesset has voted to dissolve and to have elections. During the election campaign, this issue may be one in the political rhetoric, but isn't going to come to a law. The other thing about it is, I think, as Alan said, a lot of it had to do with putting Israel in a position with Abbas and the other Arab states to, I think, try to force them to acknowledge the reality that Israel is, in fact, the Jewish state. And by codifying this, in addition to the other things that it was planning to do, I think Netanyahu hoped to force Abbas or any other Arab leader who would make peace to accept that Israel is in fact a Jewish state.
I would add just one word to that, and that is when the United Nations partitioned Palestine into two areas, the United Nations declared that there will be two states for two people, essentially declaring that Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people, and that the other state, it wasn't called Palestine at the time, would be a nation state for the Arab people. Israel accepted that partition. The Arabs, of course, rejected it and went into a genocidal war in which 1% of Israel's population was killed defending its rights under the UN declaration. So this goes way, way back in time. Is the law needed? No, I don't think the law is needed. I think the Declaration of Independence says it all. But in a democracy, people ask for things in response to realities. And it's Abbas who started this whole thing.
And time is a situation we have to deal with. We need to step away. Gentlemen, stay with us. We'll come back with more on this subject right after this timeout. Let's just continue the conversation we're having with Alan Dershowitz and also with Dr. Mitchell Bard here talking about Israel, the upcoming elections, and what's been proposed recently in the Knesset. Gentlemen, we've both been talking, we talked in the earlier segment about the upcoming elections. Dr. Bard, is this a situation that conceivably could cost Netanyahu his government and his job as prime minister?
Well, Israeli elections are unpredictable, but given the current alignment of the parties on the right and the left, in all likelihood, Netanyahu will remain in power, but you will have a different coalition behind him, most likely bringing in the religious parties, which he was able to keep out of this present coalition. On the other hand, there is a movement to try to bring a middle-of-the-road party and middle-of-the-road coalition together that might unseat Netanyahu, but at the moment they don't have sufficient coalition partners to have a realistic chance to win. And on the left, the same problem. They really have a very narrow group of parties that are willing to support them. And in the end, Netanyahu still holds, I think, the best cards.
Alan, do you agree with that?
Well, I agree that it's unpredictable. The Israeli political system has been a mess from the very beginning. There are too many parties. There's too much coalition building. Elections are almost never referendums on either how a prime minister has done in the past or what the country is looking for in the future. It's much more about deal-making and coalition building. Israel tried for a while to have a more presidential system of electing the prime minister, and that didn't work. So nobody should read too much into election results. Obviously, my own preference, the preference I think many American supporters of Israel, would be to have a more centrist government that was much more open to making peace and having a two-state solution. So I'm hoping for that outcome. I myself never get involved in domestic Israeli politics, but I'm a big supporter of the two-state solution of the peace process. But, it's very important not to focus too much attention or too much demonization on Israel. For example, this nationality bill. I'm going to England in the next couple of days, and when I'm in England, I am in an Anglican country where the Queen of England is the defender of the faith. There is an established church in England. Until relatively recently, Jews were not allowed to become prime minister. When Disraeli became the prime minister, he had to convert to the Anglican Church. Most countries in the world today have national statements, a religious preference. Israel, even if this bill were to pass, which it will not do in its present terms, would be among the most secular, liberal, and democratic countries in the world. So the question always has to be, why is there so much focus on controversies in Israel when virtually every country in the world has similar controversies?
There are controversies outside of Israel, but involving the nation state. Dr. Bard, for example, the UN now overwhelmingly approving a resolution trying to force Israel to surrender any nuclear weapons it might have, or at least place them under international oversight. How concerned should Israel be with this action by the UN?
Well, the UN has been regularly passing literally dozens of resolutions against Israel every year. And when they come from the General Assembly, they have no binding power, and they've really had no impact. The only way you're going to influence Israel is through direct negotiations. And I think the most important thing going on is that there's been a transformation in the conflict between the Jews in Israel and the Arabs and Muslims in the Middle East. In particular, this whole conflict has really shifted from what once was a battle over history and politics and geography to more and more a religious war. We're hearing more and more of this kind of religious rhetoric out of not only Hamas, but also from the PLO.
Dr. Bard, we will have to leave it there. To Alan Dershowitz, the author of the book Terror Tunnels, and to Dr. Mitchell Bard, the author of the work After Anatevka. Gentlemen, we thank you very much for your time.